and welcome back to my channel. In today's video I sort of want to carry on from where I left off, where I was talking about strengths-based social work and how it was being used to deny support and to make cuts, and how problematic in reality the strengths-based approach is. And I was doing some googling around and I came across an article in Sage journals called Psychological Strengths and Wellbeing. Strengths use predicts quality of life and well-being in autism, and that was from January of 2023. So this article was a research article looking at the use of strengths-based interventions in autism and their use in raising well-being and helping autistic adolescents build their self-esteem, with the aim of kind of making them more employable and things like that. And it mentioned how Autistica, which is a UK-based charity, has published an action briefing calling for an adoption of strengths-based approaches, addressing a low rate of employment, etc. And this obviously comes within a wider context of recently the government's push to try and get more autistic people into work. It all seems to be part of the same kind of impetus. And this article looked at how historically strengths-based autism research referred to autistic strengths, for example, attention to detail, as areas of ability. However, these strengths have been found not to be unique to autism, although they do occur more frequently in the autistic population, but they're not unique to autism, those strengths. And also, historically, there have been small studies and a lack of non-autistic comparison groups. So whether they are indeed more common in autism remains unclear. So they appear to occur more frequently in autistic people, but because the studies have been small and without non-autistic comparison groups, the evidence is rather limited at present. And also how generalisable such strengths are to all autistics remains unknown, but these strengths have been used a lot, these so-called autistic strengths have been used a lot in sort of, well, what I would call positive stereotyping, which is stereotypes are stereotypes. And if you're asking me, this is very problematic, because obviously, indeed, not all autistic people have those strengths, and even if those strengths are present, that doesn't mean that they can be used to offset the difficulties necessarily. So this article argues that maybe a more general focus on strengths, i.e. those common to both autistic and non-autistic people, so sort of neutral strengths that aren't specific to any group, just strengths in general, taking a more sort of individual approach, a more personalised approach might be better. But the strengths commonly seen as autistic are often incorporated into clinical work, into clinical educational and work settings. For example, interventions to improve their suitability for autistics. For instance, incorporating technology, which is seen as an autistic strength. So often, like, various interventions will focus on so-called autistic strengths, such as technology, and sort of use those so-called autistic strengths to help autistic people become more employable. But obviously that's really problematic, because not all autistic people are interested in technology or even good at technology. But if autism, and as this article argues, if autism-specific strengths are not evident, the continued promotion of autistic strengths may do more harm than good, resulting in stereotypes, as I just mentioned, and unrealistic expectations of autistic people. And of course there are economic consequences in this as well, because global corporations often use recruitment strategies that are grounded on so-called autistic strengths. The article also suggests that it's possible autistic people already optimise their strengths use to compensate for autism difficulties. If this is the case, then interventions further promoting strengths may be futile and detrimental to well-being, because strength overuse can actually result in a strength becoming disadvantageous. I thought that was actually interesting, because strengths up to a point can help a person compensate to some extent for their difficulties. I'm just trying to think for myself. So, for example, you could argue that one of my strengths, and I don't think this is related to my autism, I think this is just a strength I happen to have. Everyone's got their own strengths, and saying this is related to my autism, if you ask me, is quite dehumanising. But I say one of my strengths I feel that I do possess is I am very determined, and I persist at things, and I'm also always willing to kind of challenge myself where I can. Obviously there are certain things I can't challenge myself because it's too much for me or too overwhelming, but I do, where I can, I do try and push myself within limits. And I persist at things. Like, I taught myself how to knit. I'm always looking at ways to kind of spend my time and be creative with my time and do things. I guess you could call that a strength. And yet, if I were to overuse that strength, I'd result in extreme overwhelm and exhaustion, because it wouldn't be sustainable for me to be always challenging myself. It might be a strength that I am prepared to do that when I feel able enough to do so. And I've often had support workers say in the past, how determined and motivated I am, and that they were impressed by that. So, maybe that is a strength of mine, but, you have to know your limits, and it wouldn't be beneficial for me to be overdoing that, because that would just result in exhaustion. And, so I guess you could say one of my strengths is that, I like to do stuff. I'm quite productive. I always try and find ways to use my time. I always want to be doing things and discovering things and learning things. To kind of overdo that strength, maybe a bit like I don't know what the social worker was thinking, but maybe kind of assumption that because I can do those things, that then I should be able to do some other stuff as well, is really counterproductive, and actually that would then result in those strengths becoming a deficit and would actually make me absolutely exhausted and burnt out. So I thought that was interesting. Because strength overuse can result in a strength becoming disadvantageous. You need to have balance. It also says here a very important point that autism difficulties and societal constraints may limit the extent to which strengths use promotes positive outcomes, for example, employment. So that's an important point. So it's not exactly rocket science working out why the autistic employment rate is so low, because as I talked about in other videos, the very nature of autism itself can make employment really, really difficult, and an autistic person, say, might have a special interest and be really, really interested in something, and might accrue loads and loads of knowledge and expertise in that area, and that might be a strength for them. I guess my strength, you could say, is cooking, because I've invested a lot of energy and a lot of time and dedication to that interest over the years. But because of all my difficulties, some of them caused by the autism and also some by the OCD, although they all interact, means that, I'm never going to be able to work. I'm unemployable for life, and that strength, it's a strength within my own kitchen, it is a strength, but at the same time, it's not going to really it's not going to help me, like, I can't use it to get a job or anything like that because I can't work, and like I said, if that strength is overused, then I'll neglect other areas of life, other aspects of adulting, which indeed tends to happen anyway because of my extreme monofocus, which is why I need doers, not just helpers, as well. So this large study, challenged the idea that at a group level there are autism-specific strengths. And I'd agree, I don't think there are autism-specific strengths. I think that just results in these stereotypes which are really negative and stigmatising and dehumanising. And also, the many diverse strengths that autistic people have are indeed shared with their non-autistic peers. So it's challenging the idea that, there are autism-specific strengths. And inaccurate stereotypes, and also clinicians may inappropriately attribute someone's strengths to their autism diagnosis. There's a need to address the unhelpful rhetoric that autistic populations must offer unique strengths to make a contribution to society. And indeed, I think that was an important point, a bit like with the government's idea that somehow neurodiversity is an asset, which is actually deeply stigmatising, because everyone's an asset, like everyone is valuable. And the implication here is that you're only valuable if you have some of these positive stereotype strengths that are not all autistic people have. And that is deeply stigmatising and offensive to those people who don't possess the long list of strengths they always come out with. And they're always the same tired old tropes, good at maths, good at technology. Like, there are loads of autistic people who are really bad at those areas and yet might have strengths in other areas. And that is deeply dehumanising and offensive, and quite frankly makes me quite angry. So and this idea that autistic or other disabled people must somehow compensate for their disability by providing some use value to the economy or something is also deeply offensive. Like, why can't we just be valuable as people? Why do we have to constantly justify our existence? So again, it also looked at strengths. It also looked at the knowledge and the use of strengths in the autistic group, and it found lower strengths, knowledge and use in the autistic group. So in other words, the study seemed to suggest that autistic people were less aware of their strengths and also were less likely to use their strengths. And it suggested a reason for this, in that in non-autistic people, identification and encouragement of their strengths by others is key to building strength knowledge. And also, it suggested that, given the long-standing deficit approach, clinicians and teachers may be oriented towards identifying and supporting difficulties, limiting positive cues for aid strength identification. So this article was very much a kind of neurodiversity paradigm article, a kind of this whole idea that we mustn't talk about deficits and all of that, which obviously I disagree with. I think it's important to kind of look at the whole person and their difficulties and strengths, but also to be realistic. And I don't like this whole move away from deficit language. I think that this wholesale removal of deficits from language, I think, is deeply problematic and is basically resulting in the erasure of disability. And anyone who talks about deficits now is made to feel bad for talking about deficits. And I think that this is part of a neoliberal agenda of trying to silence anyone who's disabled and turn it all into a positive, because neoliberalism can't handle anything negative, because it's like a strongman, what I call the strongman ideology. Obviously, just focusing on someone's deficits isn't healthy either, obviously, but it's just too far. It's going right the other way now. Whereas it's just better to have a kind of holistic, balanced approach. And it's not bad having deficits. Everyone's got things they struggle with. Why is that a bad thing? Why is it a bad thing just to know what you struggle with? It's good to know what you struggle with, and it's also good to know what you're good at. But saying we mustn't talk about deficits completely, that is just really reductionistic, and I just don't think that's helpful or realistic. And that can lead to a unnatural inflation of self-esteem, which can be just as bad as a low self-esteem, when instead you need a sort of balanced appraisal of yourself. So it talks about lower self-efficacy and self-esteem in autism as well, but it links it to a deficit approach. I disagree. I actually feel that my self-esteem is actually lowered by the neurodiversity movement, ironically. Like, I actually know what my strengths are, and I also know what my difficulties are, and I don't like the way I'm constantly made to feel bad for talking about my difficulties. Like I do have a lot of difficulties, and that's just reality, and I should be allowed to talk about them without feeling bad about it. Like, that's what life is. All of us have difficulties. Everyone at times gets disabled. Disability is part of life. We should be able to talk about it, and it really annoys me the way, like, oh, we mustn't talk about disability, we mustn't talk about death. Yeah, it's just going way too far now, I feel, like way too far in the other direction, and I feel that can actually be harmful to someone's sense of self and self-esteem as well, which is never talked about. But yeah, it was interesting that it suggests that many autistic people don't know what their strengths are. Maybe I buck the trend there, because I would say I am pretty self-aware. And I do know what my strengths are pretty good, actually, and I also do know what my weaknesses are. I feel I do have quite a lot of self-awareness, which I don't think I had when I was younger, funnily enough. It was slow coming on board, and I think part of the reason why I've developed quite a lot of self-awareness is just reading. I've read a lot of psychology books. In actual fact, psychology was my special interest in my early 20s, so I literally read loads of psychology books. I psychoanalysed myself, I did my own therapy, like essentially reading loads and loads of books all about it, and I do feel that I've developed quite a lot of understanding about myself over the years, and I do feel that now I do understand my strengths, I do understand my limitations, and I do know how my brain works pretty well. So maybe I'm an exception among autistic people. So it's certainly not the case that all autistic people don't understand their strengths, but maybe a lot of them do have that problem, but I don't think I do. And it really annoys me, like, when he's patronising social workers, assuming that just because I'm autistic I don't know myself. That is the height of infantilisation, and they gaslight as well, and that's really offensive. Like being told I need to change the way I think of stuff. It's like, fuck off. Like, seriously, you know what I mean? Excuse my language. I know myself. I know myself very well. I know what I don't like. I know what my strengths are. I know what I find difficult, and I know where I can challenge myself, and where it's too bad, and where I would and when's enough is enough. I know that about myself. I think I know myself pretty well. Maybe that's a strength of mine. Anyway, yeah, it did seem, this article, like it mentioned, there was one person, it says a teenager who apparently sees his autism as a strength, not a deficit now. So seeing yourself as having deficits is a bad thing. It's like, for me, autism is a deficit, but that doesn't make the whole of me a deficit. Clearly, because I'm more than my autism. Like, autism is obviously a big part of me, but like, you can't reduce me to it either. Just like you can't reduce me to me being a woman. Being a woman is the whole of me in one sense, you know, like, and it obviously, you know, I'm a woman, I'm a biological female, you know, obviously that's going to affect your experiences in life, and yet I would never say that everything I do or how I behave is because I'm a woman or because I'm a female. So something can massively shape who you are, but it's not like literally everything about you. And that's the same. Autism is the same. It's the same as my femalehood. It's the same sort of thing. It's a big part of me, obviously. It's a big part of my identity, just like being a woman is. But it's not the whole me. You know what I mean? Obviously it's different to me being a woman, because it's